much time do you want me to take care?
You got about 15 minutes.
Okay, great. So thanks everybody for joining the call. I just want to reiterate Mikhail's comments about Vanatech. If you're involved in the vanadium space in any manner, particularly if you're involved in the energy storage space, this is an organization that will really be helpful. I think they bring a lot of information here. You have access to virtually everybody in the vanadium industry through Vanatech, and the cost of membership as an associate member is extremely low. So I would encourage you to think about that. So I'm going to walk through some data here. John, if you want to go to the next slide, we're going to talk about what's going on right now in the vanadium world. This is the published price. Normally for vanadium, people are looking at published prices as indexes in the market. The most frequently referenced index is the Metal Bulletin published price. Metal Bulletin will publish prices every Friday for V2O5 in warehouse Rotterdam and FOB China. And what this picture is showing us is that prices in 2023 peaked out at $10.80 in February and have subsequently wound down to $6.25 as of last week. So that's about a 42% decline during the year. Next slide, John. As John pointed out just now, there's a very massive amount of vanadium that's consumed in rebar, particularly in China. And this data is showing weekly rebar production in China. And you can see the decline from the peak in July of 2020 to down to today. We've seen about a 36% decrease in rebar production, and I think we can say that vanadium consumption in Chinese rebar is 36% lower today than it was in July 2002, and that's a big reason for some of the softness we've seen in the market recently. Next. This is a little busy, but it's an interesting picture here. The red line shows what's going on in terms of production of vanadium in China. And we're focused on China because most of the vanadium is produced there, most of the vanadium is consumed there, and most of the changes in the supply-demand picture are really occurring in China. Everything else is an order of magnitude smaller. But you see the increase in production, the red line, over the last year or so coming out of China until the last few months. So you see that red line turning down. The yellow line is the Metal Bulletin price, FOB China, and you can see perhaps some correlation between the price and the production numbers there in China. And the blue line is the calculated consumption of vanadium. I should point out that line does not include energy storage. We're looking at traditional markets here. So production's moved up. Consumption's moved down, and we've seen what the price has done. And more recently, we've seen perhaps some reaction from the supply base in China to the falling market. Next, please. So, just summarizing the market, we've seen the price drop about 40% this year. The rebar numbers account for the vast majority of vanadium consumption. We see significant increase in production in China, as much as 26% year on year. And again, more recently, we've seen production numbers dropping a bit. So let's look at some import-export data here. This is looking at monthly imports and exports from China. The blue lines are exports, and there's fairly consistent level of exports here over the last year and a half. What's interesting is the level of imports seem to have moved up. They were very strong in October, very weak in September, so maybe there's some averaging there, but you can see a definite upward trend in the amount of vanadium being imported into China over the last 10 months or so. Next slide, please. This is that same data on an annualized basis, and you can see we're projecting 2023 net exports of vanadium to be very low compared to the last 10 or 12 years. And typically the availability and price expectation of Chinese exports is what sets vanadium market prices. Okay, here, just looking at the net exports on a monthly basis, and we see here it's in October, net exports were essentially zero. They were large in September, so again, maybe there's a month-to-month issue here, but it is a bit of a trend. Next, please. To me, this is very interesting. As I said, we've seen imports into China grow, and it looks like predominantly those growing imports are coming from Russian origin vanadium. This is vanadium coming out of the ground in Russia and either refined in Russia or in Czech or in Austria. And if you do the math here, these numbers account for the majority of the imports going into China, and it's a relatively new phenomenon. Next, please. So yeah, exports are projected to be fairly stable. Imports are up compared to history. Vanadium net imports are as high as we've seen in a long time, and we've seen a lot of Russian vanadium going into China. Next, please. Okay, let's look at the consumption side here. In order to have a view on vanadium consumption, you have to have a view on steel production, because still the vast majority of the vanadium goes into steel production. And in our forecast here, we're assuming flat steel production on a global basis from 2022 onwards. I know that 2023 is probably going to be a slight step back from 2022 levels. There's a lot of forecasts out there, anywhere from 1% to 3% compound annual growth rate. We're taking a conservative view here and suggesting in our numbers is the idea that there will be no growth in global steel production. Next. This is the forecast from Guidehouse Research, and we've seen some of those numbers before. Basically, the forecast suggests that energy storage is going to consume close to 140,000 metric tons of V a year by 2030. And just for context, global production and consumption today is about 125,000 metric tons. So we're talking about a massive increase in supply and demand of vanadium. Next, please. So this is how I kind of see it rolling out. One thing to note here in these numbers, we break out energy storage from the regions. It's difficult to project the demand into any region, so we treat that separately. But you can see here what the trend is. European production is projected to be, relatively flat going forward. North American similar. Again, if you just look at China, we see some very significant increases in production coming down the road, and that China's accounts for the vast majority of the change here. Next. So if we put our projection for demand for vanadium in traditional markets, the steel industry with flat steel production, chemical energy industry with global GDP type growth rates, and titanium industry applications, we're going to see a picture that looks like we're going to need about 265,000 metric tons of V by 2030. To be supplied to the market. So the consumption numbers here, again, the blue line's traditional markets, the gray line is energy storage forecast. And what that tells us is we need to see production grow at a compound annual growth rate of about 11.6% over this period in order to have the units available to meet this forecast in demand. Next, please. Yeah, so steel production, I think we've seen very high growth in the last 20 years. That's going to flatten out. Vanadium consumption rates, specific consumption rates, will continue to grow as high-strength, low-alloy steels continue to replace carbon manganese steels. And there's a very strong economic driver for that substitution to continue. The idea of using high-strength, low-alloy steels rather than carbon manganese steels, a recipe we've been making for 140 years, leads to a minimal consumption of raw materials and energy, and a minimum amount of pollution generation for a given amount of output. And because of the value through the entire chain there, that's going to just continue to grow. Of course, we see very strong growth in energy storage applications. Next, please. Okay, we'll go to some data here on production history. This is just kind of giving you a picture of keep in mind that 19.1% compound annual growth rate we're looking for from the demand side. And you can see what the historical growth in production has looked like. And you can see, for example, 2022 to 2023, looks like we're going to see about a 19% growth in supply. And that's, again, primarily due to China. Next. Looking annually at the change in supply. Again, we're looking for that 13% growth rate to meet the forecast. It's 13% is a big number, but it's not a number that hasn't been seen in the past. So intermittently, we've seen years where vanadium production has grown by close to 20%. So the challenge will be for the industry to bring new capacity online and meet this forecast on a consistent basis. Next, please. Okay, this picture basically is looking at the supply base, the areas in this chart. The green space is existing production from existing sources. As of 2023, the orange line is what we project as expansions from existing producers or people that have produced in the past, and then the gray area is really unspecified required supply from new sources. And that, trying to define what sources are going to fill that gap becomes very difficult. But that's what we're going to be looking for, is an additional 74,000 metric tons of V from new sources by 2030 to meet this forecast. Next, please. In terms of availability, John's kind of covered this. There's vanadium everywhere in the world. There's more vanadium in the ground than a lot of minerals, and it's just a question of how quickly can you get it out of the ground and at what cost. This chart, is going to show you that the abundance of vanadium in the Earth's crust is higher than that of nickel or lithium or cobalt or copper or a number of other battery metals. So as John mentioned, the wrong question is there enough vanadium? There's absolutely enough vanadium. The question is, again, how quickly we'll get it out of the ground and at what cost. Next, please. So, we find vanadium in a lot of different minerals. Its concentration in the crust is high, and there's plenty of reserves out there. So don't worry about availability of vanadium. There's other things to worry about. Next slide, please. So we expect to see some significant increases from existing producers or producers who are idle right now and can come back online. We need significant amount of new supply by 2030, and there's dozens and dozens of potential projects out there that could fill that space. Defining which projects are going to come online first becomes very tricky. Next, please. Now let's just quickly look through some market data here. This is Vanatech data, and what's interesting here is we're looking at the three minor markets for vanadium. We're ignoring steel for the time being, but looking at these markets, we see, the titanium line. Titanium took a huge hit in COVID. It's recovering nicely. The projections are by 2023, consumption in titanium industry will be back to 2019 levels. Consumption in chemicals has been very steady right through COVID with fairly good growth. Again, these are typically mature applications, so you don't see massive growth, but you see kind of GDP type growth rates year on year. And of course, the important picture here is the yellow line, and we see the demand in energy storage really turning up quite significantly when we look at this annual data. Next slide. Same data, looking at it on a quarterly basis, and the move up from energy storage applications is even more pronounced. Next slide, please. Here is an effort to try and look at what we report as actual consumption historically by quarter with what the Guidehouse forecast had indicated. And you'll see that in general, the Vanatech numbers reported consumption are lower than the projected consumption from Guidehouse. But as you move forward in time here, those numbers start getting closer and closer. And, all the action right now seems to be in Asia, and the Western forecast from Guidehouse hasn't been met. But if we go to the next slide here, and we just look at the Asia Pacific market where most of the action is, it's interesting to see that the Vanatech reported consumption numbers in the first part of this chart were below the Guidehouse numbers. But now as we move into 2023, what we're reporting as actual consumption has moved above the Guidehouse projections for this important sector of the market. Next slide, please. So we're seeing growth in vanadium consumption consistently. The titanium industry was knocked on the head and is coming back now. Chemical demand has been pretty flat, and obviously energy storage consumption's grown significantly. Next, please. Okay, we'll move through this quickly, John, and save you some time. This is just historical data, metal bulletin price. This is nominal prices, so it's not inflated. And you see over this 20-year period, the mean price is $8.41. This is a distribution chart looking at that same data. Again, the mean is 841, and you see most of the time the vanadium price is somewhere between $6 and $8 historically. When we look at long-term prices, we've got to think about inflationary factors as well. This is the producer price index that I've rolled into my data to go from nominal numbers to real numbers or inflated numbers. And if we go to the next slide, we see the effect of inflation on those average prices moving up from $8.47 to $12.11. So, to have a view on what prices might look like in the future, you have to have a view on what's going to happen with inflation. Next slide is the distribution chart for this inflated data. And in this case, you see the price is typically between $7 and $12. Next slide, please. Okay, we can go on. So, yeah, vanadium prices are falling right now. We don't expect to see significant growth in steel production going forward. We will continue to see growth in specific vanadium consumption rates. Energy storage application is the wild card. How much demand is going to show up, and which projects that have been announced out there are going to get funded and get built first. This last point, if we look at on an inflated basis, the long-term average price for commodity grade V2O5 is about $12 a pound of V2O5. Next, John. I think that's it. Okay, I'm going to shamelessly put in a quick commercial here for US Vanadium. This is a snapshot of some of the electrolyte storage space at the plant in Hot Springs. Next slide, John. We're producing very high purity electrolyte in Hot Springs. Next slide. And Hot Springs is a secondary vanadium producer. We recover vanadium from residues resulting from either burning or refining vanadium-bearing oils rather than mining. And as a result of that, our carbon footprint's pretty low. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thanks. My email addresses are here in this presentation. If anybody has any questions or comments or criticisms, glad to hear them. Just pop me a message. And John, thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.